Somewhere in your neighborhood decades ago, the man 2 doors down could have been a convicted killer, and there would have been no way for you to know it. The law caught him once, marked him, and let him go. In England, a person convicted of manslaughter could be branded on the hand with a hot iron and released the same day. The brand existing purely so a court could prove this mercy had already been used. The actual branding iron from one of these courtrooms still sits in Lancaster Criminal Court today, a long bolt with a letter on the end. There was no file, no photograph, no way for a magistrate 50 miles away to know that hand had ever felt the iron. Keep your fist closed, give a different name, and the conviction stopped existing the moment you crossed into the next county. So how did a country with real trials and real convictions let killers disappear and start over somewhere else? For most of its history, it did not try very hard to stop them. It built one workaround, watched it fail, built a second, watched that fail too, and did not close the gap for good until something happened decades later that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. We start with the brand, because the brand was supposed to be the answer, and it lasted less time than you would think. The branding itself came out of a much older legal idea called benefit of clergy, a privilege that began as a way to spare literate clergymen from execution and slowly widened until almost any first-time offender could claim it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, a defendant convicted of manslaughter, a killing that fell short of murder, could read a short Bible verse aloud, often the 51st Psalm, and walk away from the gallows entirely. The catch was that this mercy could only be claimed once in a lifetime. So the court needed some permanent way to know the next time this same person stood trial that the privilege had already been used. The answer was the brand. A letter burned into the base of the thumb or the meat of the hand, the letter chosen to match the crime. An M for murder, a T for theft, a sentence carried out in front of spectators at the close of the court session. For a brief window between 1699 and 1707, judges experimented with branding convicts on the cheek instead of the hand, reasoning that a mark on the face would be harder to hide and would deter crime more effectively. It worked exactly as intended and ruined the system in the process. Men and women branded on the cheek became visibly, permanently unemployable, which pushed many of them straight back into crime out of desperation. Parliament reversed the policy within a decade and returned the brand to the hand, where a glove or a closed fist could hide it from anyone who did not already know to look. The mechanism worked, in its narrow way, exactly once. A defendant in Tennessee named John Irwin stood before the Giles County Circuit Court in 1828, convicted of murder, and pled benefit of clergy. The court branded the letter M into his hand, sentenced him to 8 months, and released him. Irwin's case shows the system performing precisely as designed: a clean conviction, a single permanent mark, a sentence served. The same court records reveal exactly how that design fell apart. A man named Crenshaw, convicted of horse stealing in Williamson County and indicted separately for a second theft and a forgery, claimed benefit of clergy on the first felony. Under the old interpretation of the law, the other 2 charges were simply dismissed, since at common law, any one of the 3 crimes would have hanged him anyway, so the remaining indictments were treated as redundant. 1 brand, 3 felonies erased. The mark was supposed to represent a permanent record. In practice, it represented a single-use coupon that wiped a man's slate clean of everything attached to it. The brand itself was never as permanent as the ritual implied. Convicts wealthy enough to bribe the executioner, or simply lucky enough to draw a sympathetic official, sometimes received the iron cold. Charles Moretz, a young German visiting England in 1782, wrote in his diary about watching a clergyman convicted of manslaughter for killing a man in a duel get burnt in the hand. In Moritz's words, if that could be called burning, which was done with a cold iron. No heat, no scar, no mark at all. The clerk still said his line. The court still recorded the sentence as carried out. The man walked free, with a hand that told the next magistrate, anywhere in the country, absolutely nothing. This was the failure that mattered most. A brand only worked as identification if the person reading it knew the code, examined the hand, and had some reason to ask in the first place. Move 2 counties away, present yourself under a different name to a magistrate who has never seen you, and your scarred thumb becomes a curiosity rather than evidence. There was no file to check it against. There was no way to search for it. The mark existed only in the place it was made, and the moment a man got on a horse and rode out of that jurisdiction, the mark stopped functioning as a record at all. Something had to fill that gap, and what filled it was paper. By the middle of the 18th century, London's magistrates had started trying to solve the distance problem the only way available to them, getting descriptions of wanted offenders physically into the hands of people who might recognize them. Henry Fielding, a magistrate at Bow Street, organized a small group of paid constables in 1749 to actively pursue offenders, rather than simply respond after the fact. A genuine departure from the old system where ordinary citizens were expected to chase down criminals themselves under the ancient practice of the hue and cry. His half-brother John Fielding, blind since the age of 19, took over the office in 1754 and pushed the idea further. John Fielding was reportedly able to identify habitual offenders by voice alone, a skill that became part of his legend at Bow Street. His most important contribution was a newspaper. Fielding began publishing a weekly bulletin listing recent crimes and descriptions of suspected offenders, later renamed Hue and Cry, distributed to magistrates and constables well beyond London itself. For the first time, a description of a wanted man could travel faster than the man himself, at least in theory. The Bow Street Runners, as Fielding's officers came to be known, gained the authority to pursue suspects across county lines, something ordinary parish constables had never been permitted to do. A magistrate in a town 2 days' ride from London could, in principle, read a description of a wanted killer and recognize him walking down the street. In practice, the system depended entirely on whether the bulletin actually reached you and whether you happened to read it closely enough to connect a stranger's face to a paragraph of printed text. Hue and Cry was circulated mainly to magistrates and law officers, not posted on every tavern wall in the kingdom, and its reach thinned out the farther you traveled from London. A description was also a blunt instrument. Height, build, a scar if one was visible, an accent if it was distinctive. None of it held up against a determined man who simply gave a false name, claimed to be from somewhere else, and kept his hands in his pockets. The Bow Street Runners could chase a known offender across a county line. They could not chase a man nobody had identified in the first place, and a fresh name in an unfamiliar town was usually enough. By the 1860s, this gap had become impossible for Parliament to ignore. Branding had been abolished in England in 1822 for most offenses, leaving courts with no physical mark at all, and the patchwork of local bulletins and parish constables had no way to track the growing population of repeat offenders moving freely between cities. In 1869, Parliament passed the Habitual Criminals Act, which allowed magistrates to summon anyone released from prison on a ticket of leave and demand proof that they were earning an honest living. 2 years later, the Prevention of Crimes Act of 1871 went further, ordering registers of every person convicted of crime to be kept centrally, in London for England, Edinburgh for Scotland, and Dublin for Ireland. For the first time, a magistrate in one city had a real, searchable way to learn that the man in front of him had already been convicted somewhere else. The registers needed something more precise than a written description, and the answer that took hold across Europe was a system invented by a French criminologist named Alphonse Bertillon. Bertillon's method, called anthropometry, was built on the idea that no two people shared an identical combination of measurements: head length, head breadth, the length of the left foot, the length of the middle finger, the span from elbow to fingertip. Officers recorded these figures alongside photographs and notes on scars, marks, and tattoos, building what amounted to a numerical fingerprint of the body itself. For 2 decades, Bertillonage was treated as the gold standard, adopted by police forces across Europe and the United States, the closest thing the world had to scientific proof that the man in custody was who the registers said he was. In 1903, the system collapsed in a single afternoon at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. A man named Will West was brought in for processing, and the clerks ran his measurements, just as they had thousands of times before. The numbers matched an existing prisoner almost exactly, a man supposedly already incarcerated under the very similar name William West. Routine, the clerks assumed, simply a filing oversight. Then someone checked and discovered that the other William West was, in fact, already serving time in that same prison. 2 unrelated men, sharing almost no family connection, sharing a name by coincidence and a face by even stranger coincidence, had measurements close enough to be functionally indistinguishable under Bertillon's system. The only thing that finally separated them on paper was a set of fingerprints, a method most American police forces had not yet fully adopted. Fingerprinting had been developing in parallel for years before the Leavenworth case forced the issue. The British scientist Francis Galton had spent the 1880s studying the uniqueness and permanence of fingerprint patterns, building the scientific foundation that police forces would eventually rely on. Edward Henry, serving as Inspector General of Police in Bengal, developed a practical classification system based on Galton's research and brought it into use at Scotland Yard, which formally adopted fingerprinting as its primary identification method in 1901. On the other side of the world, entirely independently, an Argentine police official named Juan Vucetich had already devised his own fingerprint classification system in 1891 and used it to solve a double murder in the coastal town of Necochea the following year. A conviction that predated fingerprint use in either England or France by a full decade. 2 unconnected systems developed an ocean apart, converging on the same solution because it was the only one that actually held up. After the West case, American police departments that had clung to Bertillon's measurements largely abandoned them within a generation, and fingerprinting became the backbone of criminal identification it remains today. This finally closed the loop that branding and hue and cry had left wide open for centuries. A fingerprint did not fade like a brand, could not be misread like a written description, and did not depend on a bulletin physically reaching the right magistrate's desk. A man's past now followed him no matter how far he traveled or what name he gave at the door. There is a piece of this story that the registers, the measurements, and the fingerprints all conveniently leave out, and it complicates everything that came before it. While Britain spent the 1860s and 70s building the apparatus to stop convicted offenders from quietly reinventing themselves in a new town, it had already spent nearly a century running the largest officially sanctioned version of exactly that, on a continent it had claimed for the purpose. Beginning in 1788, Britain transported convicted offenders, including those guilty of violent crimes, to the penal colonies of New South Wales, rather than housing them in overcrowded prisons or hulks at home. Most were transported for theft, but men and women convicted of manslaughter and other serious offenses were sent as well, sentenced to labor in the colony for a fixed term. What happened after that term ended is the part rarely mentioned alongside the branding irons and the criminal registers. Convicts who served their time or who earned a pardon for good behavior became known as emancipists, free to own land, free to take up trades, free in every meaningful sense to start over with no obligation to disclose what had brought them there. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who governed New South Wales from 1810 to 1821, actively promoted this reinvention rather than merely tolerating it, appointing emancipists to positions of trust, and even the magistracy itself, arguing that men capable and willing to serve the colony should not be permanently defined by a conviction back in England. By 1814, within 5 years of a typical sentence beginning, the overwhelming majority of convicts in a given cohort had already been emancipated and folded back into ordinary colonial life. This was not an oversight in the system, it was the system running in the opposite direction at the same time, sanctioned by the same government that was simultaneously trying to make sure no offender could quietly vanish and resurface under a new name. The difference was simply who controlled the resurfacing. A man who branded himself a clean slate by writing to the next county was treated as a fugitive from justice. A man who served his sentence in a penal colony and was handed land by the governor was treated as a success story. The branding iron at Lancaster was meant to make sure no convicted killer could simply disappear and start again. Across the empire, in the very same decades, the British government was handing convicted killers exactly that, on its own terms, whenever it suited the labor needs of a colony 8 months sailing from London. Return to that Lancaster courtroom, to the iron pressed into a stranger's thumb, to the clerk's 4 words confirming the mark had taken. A fair mark, my lord. If John Irwin stood in that same courtroom today, his name, his face, and his fingerprints would already exist in a database before the judge finished reading the sentence, connected automatically to every court in the country that cared to look. There would be no question of whether the mark was real or whether it had been applied cold as a favor. There would be no need for a mark at all. People did not lack the ability to identify a convicted killer before fingerprints existed. They lacked the infrastructure, and at times, the political will, because the very same governments building bigger tools for tracking offenders were quietly deciding that some offenders deserved a fresh start more than others. A brand that healed, a bulletin that never arrived, a register finally built out of necessity, and a colony used as a release valve for exactly the people that register was meant to catch. The fair mark was never really about the thumb. It was about who got to decide whether the mark mattered at all. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you had been a magistrate in that Lancaster courtroom, knowing the brand might be cold, the bulletin might never arrive, and the man in front of you could simply ride out of your jurisdiction by morning, would you have trusted the system you were enforcing? If you want more history like this, subscribe, and there will be a new one waiting for you every week.